Random House Audio presents Gettysburg, a guided tour from Jeff Shaara's Civil War battlefields. What happened, why it matters, and what to see, by Jeff Shaara. Read for you by Robertson Dean. Gettysburg, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1st to 3rd, 1863. What happened here? With the Federal Army remaining close to Fredericksburg, Lee knew that he could not repeat the kind of quick, spearhead advance into Maryland he had attempted the year before, which had resulted in the Battle of Antietam. Lee knew that the Union command was in shambles, and the Union Army completely demoralized after Chancellorsville. It was logical that Washington would insist that any new Federal strategy include what had been the main focus of Burnside's original plan. Thus, it was entirely likely that the Army of the Potomac would aim once again for Richmond. Once Lee finalized his strategy for another invasion of the North, he knew he could not simply march away and ignore the Federal threat. After the death of Jackson, Lee reorganized his army into 3 corps under Generals James Longstreet, Richard Ewell, and A.P. Hill, a total of about 80,000 men. As his troops began to mobilize for the march once more across the Potomac, he left A.P. Hill's corps on Marye's Heights to keep an eye on the Federals, who were still camped near the Rappahannock River. Hill's presence might convince the Union commanders that the rebels were just sitting still, which could give the rest of Lee's army a considerable head start on his march northward. But such secrecy was not to be. For most of the war, Confederate cavalry had far outclassed its opponents, the Union commanders seemingly uninterested in using their horsemen for much more than guarding supply trains. Thus, it was an unexpected tactic from the Federal command when a large force of cavalry probed Lee's positions north and west of Fredericksburg to verify the rumors that Lee was marching northward yet again. The order came from Joe Hooker, one of his final and most effective decisions made as commander of the Army of the Potomac. The irony, of course, is that if Hooker had used a significant cavalry screen to probe for Lee's position before and during the Battle of Chancellorsville, it is unlikely that Jackson's surprise flank attack would have been a surprise at all. On June 9, 1863, the Federal cavalry under Alfred Pleasonton surprised his nemesis Jeb Stuart at what became known as the Battle of Brandy Station, the largest cavalry engagement of the entire war. The result was essentially a draw, but the Confederate horsemen absorbed twice as many losses. The fact that his cavalry had been caught so completely unaware was a serious embarrassment to Stuart, who had made much of his reputation as the most celebrated horseman in either army. Though the battle seriously wounded Stuart's pride, the fight gave Joe Hooker something much more valuable: concrete information that the bulk of Lee's army was well away from Fredericksburg and was moving north. Though Hooker still favored a quick march southward toward Richmond, he couldn't simply ignore Lee's army. In Washington, it was obvious that the sudden change in Confederate strategy meant that Lee's forces could pose a significant threat to the capital. Hooker conceded that Richmond would have to wait. Throughout mid-June, as Lee marched his army toward Maryland, Hooker gave his final orders as commander and began to shift his army so as to protect a nervous Washington, D.C. The vanguard of Lee's army crossed the Potomac River on June 15th, and soon the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia gathered near Hagerstown, Maryland. Once again, their movements were screened by South Mountain, and once again they had their eyes focused on a march into Pennsylvania. The end came for Hooker on June 27th. With Lee renewing his threat to northern cities, Washington would not rely on a man who had shown no backbone for a serious confrontation. Among ranking Union officers, the consensus favored Major General John Reynolds to be Hooker's successor. Despite Reynolds' clear-cut qualifications for the job, he was viewed by official Washington as a man with political ambition, who might use the position to speak out against Lincoln's policies, a charge that few in the Army took seriously. Despite the Army's support of Reynolds, the choice more amenable to Washington was the distinctly apolitical George Meade. Meade was a chronically short-tempered man, quick with a sharp tongue, and though he was respected by his troops, he was not especially well liked by many of his new subordinates. Meade himself was surprised by the appointment and was not overly eager to accept the new assignment. He agreed with some of the men around him that there were others better qualified for the job. But Meade also knew his duty, so with a possible crisis looming, he quickly accepted the responsibility. Unlike Burnside, who sought out less challenging options, Meade could not afford the luxury of time. He had no choice but to protect the capital, while at the same time he had to make every effort to figure out just what Lee was up to. With uncharacteristic speed, the Federal Army matched Lee's northward march, Meade keeping the Federal forces between South Mountain and Washington. Lee had every reason for optimism. Jefferson Davis shared his belief that another hard push into Pennsylvania would accomplish a great deal toward ending the war. Once again, Lee could feed his army from the unspoiled farmlands of the Cumberland Valley, and if he could push his men to the Susquehanna River, that valley would lie open to him as well. His options would increase every mile he marched into Pennsylvania, and he could create panic in the minds of the U.S. Congress, the fear that even if Lee bypassed the capital, he might lay waste to Harrisburg, Baltimore, or even Philadelphia. If there was to be a great last-ditch battle to save the Union, there could be bloody devastation not only in the fields, but in towns and cities that had, until now, been spared the graphic horrors of war. Another option for Lee was that by cutting the major rail lines north of Washington, he could isolate the capital, ensuring outright chaos in the city. Lee might end the war without firing a shot. To both Lee and Jefferson Davis, this time the advantages were all on their side, except one. Jeb Stuart had been ordered to keep a close eye on Meade's army and to report any significant movements to Lee. Stuart knew that he was Lee's eyes and ears, and that if a major battle was to take place, the added power and mobility of Stuart's 8,000 cavalrymen could make all the difference. On June 24th, Stuart led 3 brigades of his men eastward, where they quickly located the rear of Meade's army. But instead of keeping himself between the two armies, as Lee had hoped, Stuart pushed his men farther, until he was on the far eastern side of Meade's line of march. From this point on, there is considerable debate and speculation about what Stuart was trying to do. On 2 previous occasions, Stuart had led his cavalry completely around the Union army, great glorious escapades that had embarrassed Union commanders and put Stuart's name prominently into newspapers in both the North and South. It is entirely likely that by making such a triumphant ride now, he would embarrass the enemy once again and redeem himself for his humiliating failures at Brandy Station. Stuart put his men to good work, cutting Meade's supply train, capturing a considerable haul of wagons and several hundred Union prisoners. In addition, he rattled the Federal flanks by making pot-shot skirmishes along their routes of march. But the spoils captured from these victories gave Stuart encumbrances that slowed him down. Meade was marching northward far more efficiently than the Confederates had reason to expect. Thus, when Stuart knew he should be reporting Meade's movements to Lee, his horsemen were trapped on the far side of Meade's army. There was simply no way Stuart could get word to his commander without passing a courier straight through the Army of the Potomac. Stuart had no choice but to leave Lee in the dark, while the Confederate cavalryman figured out how his men could best get back to where Lee needed them to be. Though Lee was uncertain just where Meade's army was, he ordered Ewell's troops to push onward to the banks of the Susquehanna River, putting Confederate forces just downriver from Harrisburg. If possible, Ewell was to cross the river and make every effort to seize the city. Lee would follow with Longstreet and Hill, supporting Ewell's movements. What Lee did not know was that on the opposite side of South Mountain, Meade was aiming for Harrisburg as well. Lee's blindness was cleared up for a brief moment by an unlikely source. On June 28th, a civilian spy employed by Longstreet reported that Meade's army was moving exactly parallel to the Confederates and had gathered close to the town of Frederick, Maryland. The report surprised Lee, who hoped that the Union forces might still be south of the Potomac River. Lee realized that if Meade continued to move northward, Ewell's corps, now close to Harrisburg, could be cut off and crushed by the Federal Army.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?